Both Jews and Muslims have deep religious connections, not only to the tombs, but also to the land. Hebron was the first place that Abraham, a Jew, purchased and owned land. It is also important to the Palestinians because they have been living there for thousands of years, since the destruction of the first temple in 1586 BCE by the Babylonians. When I was there, I remember walking around the empty streets with an unsettling feeling, like everything was on the verge of disaster, which wasn't really far from the reality. I was there one day during an Israeli raid. Apparently, this is a daily occurrence that completely shuts down areas of the city for long periods of time. The economy is in shambles because it is so conflicted, but with the raids, it makes it even more difficult for businesses to succeed. I was standing in a little tea shop when about 6 Israeli soldiers came through one of the military gates. They had their guns raised as if expecting confrontation. Most of the Palestinians ignored them completely. They proceeded through one of the side streets where I was heading. As they passed by me, I tried to ask them what they were doing. They told me no English, no English. A Palestinian man beside me turned to me and said that he had heard them speak English the day before. I couldn't figure out what they were doing. They were very strategic in the execution of this procedure. They would walk about 10 feet, stop, wait for a long period of time while allowing no one to pass, and repeat this all the way down the road. A crowd of people began to form, all of which needed to go somewhere, including a group of children who were on their way to school. As the Israeli soldiers slowly proceeded, I tried to ask them again what was going on and why this was needed. After a period of time, one of the soldiers approached me, looked me in the eye, and pointed his weapon to 2 teenagers standing in the vicinity of either side of me. He pointed to them and said, "You and you." He led them around a corner and told them to place their hands on the wall and spread their feet apart to be searched. Now, normally in Canada, an officer must have grounds or reason for a search. These 2 boys were standing silently beside me, waiting patiently. If anyone should have been searched, it should have been me, out of annoyance to them. They confiscated their ID cards and proceeded to publicly humiliate them for no reason. I remember feeling deeply rattled when this was happening, but looking around and seeing the children. They did not seem to be fazed by this at all. They had grown up far faster and become vessels of the social problems. One particular boy came around in front of me while they were searching the teenagers and looked me in the eye. He raised his hands over his head and made the peace sign with his fingers, fully aware of the soldiers directly behind him, guns fully loaded. I have a picture of that moment, which I often think about and look at throughout my days back here in Canada. I spoke earlier about meeting many organizations, and one organization that particularly struck a heartstring for me was a group of Israelis who had served in the Israeli Defense Force, or the IDF, and have since been discharged, but who call themselves Breaking the Silence. They all served in Hebron during one of the most violent and disturbing times in recent memory in the area, during the Second Intifada, which began in September of 2000. They are a part of a very small but growing number of individuals who are speaking out about the terrible atrocities that are happening in the occupied territories under the Israeli regime. They risk their lives and threats to tell their stories and quote, expose the true reality in the territories, and as a consequence, to promote a public debate on the moral price paid by the Israeli society as a whole. I'd like to read you a quick excerpt from one of their published books from a perspective of an Israeli soldier. Listen to the remorse in his voice. If I am standing at a checkpoint that prevents people from going somewhere it's obvious they need to get to, like from a grocery store to their house, and they and still be unfair. Because from their point of view, it makes no difference if I am a nice guy. I still don't let them go home. What difference does it make if I try to be nice or humiliate them? The very existence of the checkpoint is humiliating. Later on, he goes on to say, there is nothing I can tell them. You can't go through the checkpoint because you can't, and that's it. It's an order based on security considerations. As long as they want me to protect these 500 Jewish people, that is what I have to do. As long as they want me to protect these people in Hebron, keep them alive, and enable them to go about their existence in a reasonable manner, I have to destroy the reasonable existence of all the rest. There is no alternative. What this soldier is saying, whether he realizes it or not, is actually quite similar to what Jesus says in Matthew 25. The soldier is, however, caught between two conflicting emotions. He is caught between what is true and one that is wrong, but it's also required. Jesus says that there is no alternative but one true way. He boldly states, to which you do to the least of my brothers, you also do to me. In the soldier's statement, we can read and almost feel his remorse. How many times have we left situations wishing we had done something differently or spoken out against something we disagreed with? Hindsight is always 20/20, just as this soldier mournfully realizes. But thank goodness that Jesus tells us that there is an alternative, to treat each individual as valuable and as a son or daughter of the Almighty God, with no exceptions. One of my favorite bands is called The Fray, and they wrote a song called All at Once. One of the lines of the song goes like this: sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same. Looking at each person as Christ would isn't always easy. In fact, sometimes it's downright next to impossible. But the easy things in life don't really matter. You have to work at what is good. Another deeply moving experience I'd like to share with you was when I visited Gaza. As many of you know, Gaza has been prime media coverage in recent news. While I sat here in Canada, reading and listening to the horrendous acts occurring in January, it was no longer a place somewhere far off that was experiencing war. It was a place that I had stayed and people I had met. We had a difficult time getting our proper visas to enter into Gaza for many reasons, and in the end, only half of our group were granted access. I used to say that I was fortunate enough to be one of them, but now I say that I was blessed by God to be given the burden of the things I saw, the things that burdened God's heart. I was burdened so that I could come back and tell their story. The nearest council of churches had asked our group to lead a church service at St. Philip's Anglican Church in Gaza City. This was no ordinary church, since it had been bombed in 2004. The bomb thankfully did not explode on contact with the ground, but you can see the entry and the landing point on the roof and at the front of the church beside the altar. There has not been enough funds to repair the church, so it has been left in the same state it was on the day of the bombing. Dust and plaster cover the pews, for it has not been used since. But someone had cleaned off the first 3 rows for us, and there was not a single window